Hello, I'm Elijah Rose, the soldier turned historian, and today's topic is what everybody gets wrong about the Osage Indians. In fact, I'm sure the average viewer will admit they know very little about the Osage, but even then, what you think you do know is a good chance it's just simply wrong. The first and most common myth was that the Osage were native to southeast Kansas. This is false. Their first known point of residence was in central Missouri on the Osage River, and the river was named after them, obviously. The term Osage is believed to be a contraction of Alshalsage. I'm probably butchering that, but it means Middle Waters people, referring to how their river, the Osage River, was a tributary of the Missouri River between the Kansas and Gasconade rivers. Now, I've also seen their original name rendered as Niukonska or as Nioskonska or Aznigi, but these discrepancies are probably down to dialect splits and French versus English spelling conventions because the Osage originally interacted with the French, not the Americans. And yes, your intuition is correct. Most Indian villages were located near the major navigable rivers, with many sections of open country being completely empty. But even then, they were actually a very new nation when Europeans first arrived to the Missouri area. It is believed that at least many of the Osage were Indians from several nations who migrated from the greater Pennsylvania area to Missouri in or around 1620 AD. This was probably related to the Beaver Wars, which was a series of conflicts where the Indian nations allied to either France or England fought each other over control of and export of valuable beaver furs to Europe. After these wars, many Indian nations simply moved west looking for better hunting grounds, setting off a whole cascade of similar migrations as these migrants displaced other Indian nations. We actually don't know for a fact this is why the ancestors of the Osage left what is now Pennsylvania, but it is the right time frame, so we assume that was the case. We also don't know how well the Osage got along with the locals, if there were any, when they got to the Osage River, because we simply have no idea who lived there before the Osage got there. It is simply assumed they ended up intermarrying with Indian locals because the Osage language has more in common with the Dakota and the Kansas Indian languages than anything else. How they got from the Osage River to southeast Kansas is a story by itself, because the Osage were simply not hostile to the incoming Europeans. In fact, the Osage became very rich by Indian standards, selling furs first to French fur traders coming up from New Orleans by the Missouri River, and then later Americans who were settling in the St. Louis area. In the 18th century, at least one major Osage chief and his two wives actually traveled to France, where they saw what modernization could bring them. They even they were even seen visiting an opera house in Rouen in France. I also saw one account that say a few of the Osage were present with French forces at Braddock's defeat during the French and Indian War, where the French and their Indian allies ambushed the British and defeated them. But this is a bit dubious because of how far away the Osage lived, and I can't confirm or deny that with any contemporary source. What we do know is Washington Irving, the man who wrote Legend of Sleepy Hollow and other fictional stories, he actually met some of the Osage in his travels around the world, and he described them as the friendliest Indians he had ever met. Of course, under these conditions, you shouldn't be surprised that considerable intermarriage occurred, and by the time the America purchased the Louisiana territory, there was considerable amount of Osage who either had French names and or were Catholic. Although no figures are really possible, but there is an anecdote from an early Missouri settler saying there were 20 Missourians simply living with the Osage. Another anecdote was that Chief Strike Axe, who lived near what is now Chinook, Kansas, attended Catholic church regularly. And also Chief Little Bear, who settled in what is now Neodesha, Kansas, had an American son-in-law. Also, you can probably guess why they left Missouri. They were professional fur traders, and incoming farmers settling Missouri meant there was too much competition for game. According to one version of events I saw, it was an old French fur trader who had married into the Osage, and it was his idea to move the whole nation westward in stages to not disrupt living too much and to lay claim to better hunting grounds. This is actually something very key to note. They did not arrive before the first homesteaders in Kansas. They arrived concurrently with this. And I know this for a fact because many counties actually have graves with American names predating the arrival of the Osage to these counties. It should be noted most of these graves only show up a few years before the Osage get there, and they're all of small children, so presumably only insignificant numbers of homesteaders arrived before the Osage. But enough Americans arrived during the Osage settlement of southeast Kansas that the first census and the first votes took place in many southeast Kansas counties while the Osage were still there. The short version of events is the Osage entered Kansas in the Pittsburgh area sometime in the 1820s, and they got as far west as Wilson County, Kansas in 1851. And they would sell their whole claim to southeast Kansas for $1.25 an acre in 1870 to the federal government, having already become farmers in northwest Oklahoma. The only trace I could actually find of potential hostility of the Osage to the Union was a story from a federal Indian agent who he was sent to southeast Kansas to survey the extent of Osage settlement so that they could redraw the lines to reflect reality. It should be noticed part of the Osage treaties with the Federals was mutual extraterritoriality, so both nations could freely travel through both nations' sovereign territory. But these Indian agents encountered unidentified Osage Indians who threatened them with a war dance, and so they left and went back to the fort in Oklahoma. The Indian agents never knew why they did this, and it's frankly still unclear why this happened. My personal theory is that the Osage came to Kansas to engage in land speculation. They spread out as much as they could so they could lay claim to as much land as possible and then sell this land for a profit. Because remember, they claimed the empty land for zero nothing and then sold it later for $1.25 an acre. Note that even at the time, the Osage were never considered a primitive people, and the term that was used in the 19th century was semi civilized because they didn't have jobs or civic improvements, but they did have modern tools and professional skills. In fact, over time, the Osage began to demand payment in US dollars because the value of money was far less uncertain than the value of goods received, which may be damaged or they may be low quality or smaller than you expected. This is also something that even people living here in southeast Kansas don't understand because most of the American settlers arrived between 1865, the end of the American Civil War, and 1893, the end of railway mania. So most of the earliest settlements, earliest tales told about the early settlements about this place came from people who knew very little about the Osage, and most had simply never met them. Even local histories I've seen that were put together by very reputable newsmen have gaping holes in the stories and often include nonsensical anecdotes from locals. I saw one document that even claimed that plants and animals would up and spontaneously die when the Americans got there. I saw another that said she was not aware of any Osage American War, but if there was such a conflict, it was definitely the Americans' fault because that makes sense. Although you're probably asking Who lived in southeast Kansas if the Osage simply were not here? And the answer is we do not know. That may have been completely empty because there are simply no major landmarks or navigable rivers or fertile valleys of any consequence out here. In fact, I've actually gotten mixed up about which town I'm in sometimes because all the towns look the same out here, to be frank. However, there was one report from a federal fort in Oklahoma that said some Kiowa squaws were claiming to commander of a certain what is now called the Cutthroat Gap Massacre. They said that while their menfolk were away hunting on a hunting trip slash raid against the Ute Indians, a very large band of Osage warriors raided a village and killed everybody they found. They were able to provide many very specific details that hint that it was a real incident, such as saying that the Osage left their horses behind so they could sneak through tall grass, and that they did not take the scalps as trophies as many Indians did. Instead, they decapitated all of their victims just as proof of their death. And the last tidbit is definitely true. The Osage decapitated anyone they killed for any reason. Of course, the Union commander simply called in an Osage chief who happened to be in town and asked if any of this were true, saying, "Why cannot two Indian nations be friends?" And the Osage chief simply said, "Yes, they should be friends," and neither confirmed or denied anything about the incident. And that is simply where the matter rests. Neither confirmed nor denied. My own little theory is that the Osage and Kiowa were arguing over the ownership of a buffalo herd, as that is what counted to the Plains Indians rather than any specific plot of ground. Because the Osage maybe have been impugning on a or actively hunting a herd that the Kiowa believe to be theirs. And it is also likely if there was a major raid and a quote unquote massacre, it was probably revenge for an earlier raid taken out for whatever reason by the Kiowa. And there may be an entire war here we are simply unaware of. And on that note, it's impossible to say how violent this feud may have been, or if that the Cutthroat Massacre happened, because it may have been a smaller incident than these Kiowa squaws were letting on to. Also, no, the Osage never became full on Plains Indians. They did not live in teepees, which are tents made of buffalo hides. They lived in wigwams, which were huts made of branches, barks, and leaves. Now, I think most of the myths actually stem from the 1974 film Little House on the Prairie. Now, the movie is both really good and really bad because while it does dramatize what was a more typical Old West experience, um, what they get wrong is all the specific facts on the location because they seem to be all mismatched together. Now, the movie itself is really just a glorified pilot episode to a TV series by the same name, where the Ingalls families migrates to a point somewhere south of what is now Independence, Kansas. Now they build a cabin, they meet some of the locals, including an Osage chief, then find out a year later that the Federals redrew the lines on a map, placing their house on the wrong side of Indian territory, so they had to leave. Now, the problems with this plot are as follows. First, the town of Independence, Kansas, which should not be confused with all the other towns also called Independence, was founded in or incorporated at least in 1869, while the Osage were leaving Kansas permanently that same year. In the story, Independence is far enough away that the father, Mr. Ingalls, goes there alone because he only has one horse and it could be a multi day trip to get essentials. Now, the Little House on the Prairie Museum postdates the actual movie and is actually just a replica cabin and is 13 miles southwest of Independence on Highway 75, which is a stretch for the plot of the movie because it is possible to ride 26 miles in one day. But this is not the actual location of the cabin, and we're actually unsure where the Ingalls cabin was located. But it actually does not even matter whether that the plot location of the house or the museum location are chosen, because both of these points are outside the Osage claim. In fact, they were in the neutral zone between the Cherokee and Osage claim, just north of what is now the Oklahoma Kansas border. Also, it's unclear what year the plot is supposed to be happening in because in the plot, the Osage are arguing about what to do about the incoming homesteaders, while Independence was an established town for trade. Of course, we know from the author that this is actually supposed to happen in the late 1860s, but these things that occur in the plot could not have been concurrent. Now, I actually don't fault the movie. It's actually worth watching, but for most people, literally all they know or what they think they know about the Osage comes from this movie, either directly or indirectly. And the movie is based on novelized memoirs made by the youngest daughter of the family, who was born in like 1867. And clearly, she is writing about things that happened back when she was too young to remember. And likewise, the screenwriters don't seem to know anything about the Osage other than these fictionalized memoirs. Likewise, the Indian chief they reported to have met was called Soldat du Chêne, which means soldier of the oak. While it is plausible they met a chief with a quasi French name, there's actually no record of this man's existence in southeast Kansas outside Laura Ingalls' memoirs. According to Laura Engel herself, her parents actually never told her the guy's name. She simply went looking for someone who matched the description that she knew of him, and someone, she did not say who, told her it was Soldat Duchesne. Now, all we know about this particular Osage soldier was that he was listed as a witness on the treaty at a treaty in Fort Osage in 1808, meaning if it really is the same guy who had been a very young man at the time of the signing of that treaty and a very old man when he met the Ingalls 6 decades later. But that is plausible. However, what is more likely is that a name that best matched the description of what Laura remembered was simply pulled from a list of known Osage chiefs, and the Osage that the Ingalls met was a completely different guy whose identity is lost to time. That is to say, this story is all hearsay and in some places deliberately embellished and then filmed later in California, not Kansas. One clear factual error in the story was that the Ingalls leave under threat of eviction, but in reality, they actually did need to return to their original home to evict the guy they sold their house to because he had defaulted on his mortgage. But all of that, I actually don't fault in the storytelling. What I do fault is when people try to force the Osage story into a sort of generalized cowboys versus Indian version of history. Now, the details and problems behind that are a story for another time. The essential facts to remember are the Osage were professional fur traders. They were never hostile to migrants, and they were actually so friendly to Americans that they were on both sides of the American Civil War. Yes, you heard that right.